Welcome to MOCAD, the Museum of Contemporary Art, Detroit. My name is Amy Corll, and I'm the Curator of Education and Public Engagement here, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our talk about the life and work of Michael Luchs, whose exhibition, Fictitious Character, is on view right over there in our galleries until July 29th. Michael himself doesn't enjoy public speaking, and he's not with us here tonight, but we do happen to have three people who quite possibly know Michael and his work better than he knows himself. We have Katheryn Brackett Luchs. Katheryn was born here in Detroit. She's the daughter of two painters and an artist herself, accomplished working artist. She has been an instructor at the Stamps School of Art and Design since 1992. At an early age, she moved to the Cultural Center of Detroit and began living, painting, and filming experimental artists in what is now called the Detroit Cast Corridor. These early Super 8 documents she made at that time became an important source material for her work. Images from Detroit's Cast Corridor, an experimental video documentary that looks at Detroit's early and evolving visual arts and culture, and 8 particular artists, was created collaboratively by Katheryn with Sean Bangert. And the video premiered at the Detroit Institute of Arts in 2002 and screened at the New York International Independent Film and Video Festival. It continues to screen in visual art venues, most recently, and by that I mean like right now, here at MOCAD, in association with Michael Luchs' exhibition. For future reference, keep in mind that it is not a coincidence that Michael and Katheryn have the same last name. Nancy Mitchnick was also born in Detroit, and she too was in the same place at the same time as Michael Luchs, living and working as an artist in the Cast Corridor. A lot went on there at that time, and I'm going to leave that to her to explain to you. But what I can tell you is that at some point Nancy split for New York City, and then she moved around the country teaching and making art. And when I say teaching, I mean, Nancy taught at Wayne State, Bard College, the California Institute of the Arts, the School of Visual Arts, Summit Arts Center, the New York Studio for School and Drawing, Painting and Sculpture, the Vermont Studio Center, and the Visual and Environmental Studies program at Harvard University. This is interesting. I thought when Nancy left Harvard, the Harvard Crimson newspaper reported an overall hesitation with the arts department because she was so cherished by students and professors, like cherished. Yeah, she is an amazing and accomplished painter. She was 2015 Kresge Fellow and was selected by the prestigious American Academy of Arts and Letters as a recipient of the organization's 2016 Art Awards. Nancy eventually made her way back to Detroit, and in 2016, she had a solo exhibition right here at the Museum of Contemporary Art in that gallery called Uncalibrated. We also have Tim Van Lear. Tim is a professor, and Tim did not want me to mess with his bio in any way, and so Tim is a professor and chair of fine arts at the College for Creative Studies, and he's a visual artist who has exhibited his work throughout North America and Europe. He has co-authored 3 books and has published numerous reviews and essays. Fulbright, Yaddo, the Howard Foundation, the Illinois Arts Council, and the Karl Hofer Gesellschaft? The UCross Foundation and other institutions have supported his creative activities. The Detroit Institute of Arts, the Illinois State Museum, and Herman Miller are among the collections that include his work. He received an MFA degree from Wayne State University in 1975. So that's keeping it simple and direct, and that's all the information you're going to get about him at this time. I expect that more will be revealed. And finally, we have Robert Sestok, also born in Detroit. Robert has been creating work since 1967. He has exhibited at the Detroit Institute of Arts, Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, Cranbrook Museum of Art, and Marianne Boesky Gallery in New York City, among many other places. In 2015, he opened City Sculpture Park, a public art space in Detroit exhibiting 3 decades of work. His work is held in numerous collections, including the Detroit Institute of Arts, Cranbrook Museum of Art, and Wayne State University. Robert is the recipient of grants from the Pollock Krasner Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts. Robert keeps a low profile, but his accolades have added up over the years. He has spent his entire life in the Cass Corridor neighborhood. In 1971, he helped found the Willis Gallery, which served as the de facto home and showcase for Cass Corridor artists like Nancy and Michael Luchs. See how this is all coming together like that? Yeah. As far as I can tell, Bob has never been anything other than deathlessly cool. Back in the day, he booked the MC5 to play at a gallery opening. And not too long ago, he created a mural for Third Man Records that spans 88 feet, stands 14 feet tall. He got that gig because Jack White is a fan of his work. So we've got some major talent and expertise here with us this evening to enlighten us with insights into the mind and art of Michael Luchs. Tim is going to get us started this evening, I think. But first, even though it's already pretty warm in here, I'm hoping you will help me give them an extra warm welcome to our panelists. Bob, Nancy, Tim, and Katheryn.
I hope you can hear better than I can up here. Everything is like, can you hear anything?
Tim, you got to talk right into the mic like this.
Like this? Okay. I want to spend a few minutes talking about how I experienced the work of Michael Luchs. My thoughts are adapted from a short catalog essay that I wrote for an exhibition at Simone de Sousa Gallery. I first met Michael in the mid-'70s. I'm pretty sure he wouldn't remember me, but I remember it very clearly. I was under 25 years old and knew his work quite well from seeing it around Detroit. I was working at the Detroit Workshop of Fine Prints, which was a project run by Eris Katroulis, and it was in Common Ground for the Arts, funded by the NEA. He was in the shop hanging out with friends, and I finally met this person. At the time, my own work was really layered, gestural, mixed media, and his work shattered my ideas about process and materials. I was in awe of this guy whose work inspired me to push my drawings away from precious, conventional materials and expression. The first rabbit sculpture that I can remember, I think it was foam rubber compressed between rusty fencing. Ring a bell, anyone? Yeah. It left me dumbstruck. I just was amazed by this thing, and partly by its profound stupidity. And I mean that as a very high compliment. It was just so straightforwardly dumb to me that it was profound. I was amazed how something could be made that direct. Michael Luchs constructs his artworks as accumulations. They're layers of very banal substance, and they coalesce into charged images that radiate deeply personal experience and insight. These works are additive, one thing laid over another. Even an erasure or other act of obliteration is another kind of layer, and they're never complete in their cancellation. In this chain of reaction of materiality, Luchs's materials are not precious, not already the stuff that says art. They're spray paint, enamel, duct tape, staples, paper, and scraps of whatever is handy. the stuff more likely to be found in hardware stores than art supply shops. His untitled Silver Rabbit 1984, for example, consists of metallic enamels, spray paint, acrylic on a sheet of irregular dark gray vinyl. But materials always need procedures, and Luchs applies material with an aggressive certainty. The surface of Silver Rabbit is spattered, scraped, smeared, smudged in ways that range from lyrical to violent. Ultimately, every material reveals its vulnerability. No substance is quite capable of obliterating the others or entirely dominating the work. And the rivalry of materials, and I like to think of it that way, as materials in kind of a competition with each other, works as a major source of their energy. Abrupt shifts of texture, depth, and scale shimmer and twist in a kind of productive friction. While the material processes are central to his artwork, Luchs resists virtuosity. The conventions of superior technique are as irrelevant to his work as the historical traditions of paint application. This particularly fascinates me. These traditions and conventions are replaced with an astute psychological language of marks and gestures that exploits the raw, the awkward, the careless, the signs of immediacy and decay. Here and there, flashes of precision, grace, subtlety heighten the psychological agitation and effects of these aggressive gestures. Luchs knows when to attack the surface and when to caress it. This interest in process and gesture relates to his ambivalence about finishing work. They can always be added to, processed farther. Pieces that stay too long in the studio are likely subjects for additional transforming processes. His ambivalence about the pieces as finished objects hints at a basic question of where the art is. When process is so central, the making of an artwork is a performance or even a ritual. We see an object, but I imagine him thinking of them as performing an action. This suggests that it's better to look at Luchs' work not as pictures of things like rabbits, but as records of action and as acts of consciousness. I think it'd be wrong to go full Harold Rosenberg here. Much of Luchs' approach to art is rooted in the same issues that informed the Fluxus movement of the 1960s, the time and context in which he began his work. His questions about the nature of art, his DIY approach to technique and materials, his playfulness, his interest in chance, his acceptance of ephemerality, and his socially subversive edge have more of an affinity with Fluxus than with abstract expressionism. A big part of what gives his work its critical and psychological edginess is its excess. These images overwhelm the viewer with information. Luchs piles things on, loading the surface until disorientation sets in. At a certain point, everything that's added, everything that builds up the surface, starts tearing it down. Excess breaks up hierarchies of signs in the work. And even when excess appears decoratively in repeated patterns, like the dots that follow the contours of Silver Rabbit, it creates a crisis of knowing where things are. This is not the excess of too much consumerist pleasure, then, but a more anxious excess, a kind of hemorrhaging of dichotomies, like the permanent and the transient, the predictable and the indeterminate, the ordered and the chaotic, the powerful and the vulnerable. And this kind of borderless excess further feeds the artwork's abjection. These images signal decay and trauma, not only in the roughed up materials, but in the obliterations, the creative entropy of their surfaces. This abjection fascinates us in its attraction and repulsion, and this is a kind of anxious pleasure. As Julia Kristeva notes in Powers of Horror, the abject has a deep primal relationship with pleasure. In regard to the abject, and I'm quoting her, one does not know it, one does not desire it, one joys in it. And then finally, about the imagery. An iconic armature holds this pulsing, shifting materiality together. Luchs consistently turns to strong, iconic signs that structure the space. Animals such as frogs, squirrels, bears, and most often rabbits. The abstracted, dominating presence of these forms offers stability, even as they represent vulnerable creatures. Often the icons are static with stable contours. Other times, as in the 1989 series Untitled Squirrels and Guns, they have a brushy solidity, but they are always outlines and silhouettes. They're not a mimetic representation. They're more overtly semiotic, like pictograms, and they move these artworks into the realm of language. In some images, the addition of iconic subjects introduce the possibility of reading these enigmatic signs as narratives, of constructing brief stories from their ambiguous interactions. But their representational status doesn't leave them as pictorial subject matter. They are part of the action, the consciousness that forms the work. So I'm pleased that I had this time to talk about how I experience his work. These are my thoughts about it. I would never have guessed that I'd have this opportunity to talk about his work 43 years after I first confronted it. And I really love the way the work still talks to me and how it's still relevant to me. The work deals with a world of anxious excess and joyous abjection and complex language. And Michael Luchs makes these states of mind tangible, a changed materiality that describes a world that is present, a complex emotional, intellectual, and social world that we inhabit too. Let me end with some lines from a poem that I love, a poem that has an obvious and maybe perhaps too superficial of a surface connection with Michael's work, but that also connects with it more deeply, I think. And it's from Wallace Stevens' A Rabbit is King of the Ghosts. And to feel that the light is a rabbit light in which everything is meant for you and nothing need be explained.
Michael was born in 1938 and named Charles Wesley Boggs. And Michael was adopted in 1943 at the age of 5 and rescued by Evelyn Luchs and Fred Luchs, a minister, who took on all 4 children. Evelyn was 40 years old. And on the left here is Michael. And Michael had been abused beyond what his siblings had gone through. He'd been taken out of the orphanage, beaten up, and returned to the orphanage at 3. Not to dwell on that, what's more important here to think about is that his adoptive parents were determined to raise these children, nurture them, and give them a good education, and they felt that would make all the difference. But Michael being so fragile, Evelyn Luchs put him to bed for a year with art supplies. So he had paints and art supplies, and she kind of took care of him for that first year she had him. I met Michael and Nancy and Robert Sestok, Nancy Mitchnick and Robert Sestok in the 60s. I think the beautiful opportunity we have here is we're all painters. I met Tim this last year, and sculptors, and we've all known Michael for so many years, and we've been influenced by him. Pardon? So One I want to focus on here, being his wife and being married twice, because he was an alcoholic, and I had to divorce him and remarry him, and we went through a whole long narrative that's quite amazing. But I've been a witness to him making the art for more than 4 decades, and we share a studio. So first of all, what I want to show you is some images, just to set some working images about Michael and how he works. His favorite work was done in the cabin that we moved to in 2000. And it really speaks to how he doesn't care about the result of the object. He just wants to paint and change things from day to day. So if you don't grab the work away from him or say that's a good painting, it's gone. And I will show you, after I show you some images from the cabin, which he did over 8 years. I have hundreds. I picked out about 20 for you to get a sense. I'm going to show you some images of him actually working. We were building a studio, and it's a mile away from the cabin, which we now have a really nice working space. But this cabin was 22 by 24 feet, and that's where we started up north. And often the work would move over onto paper at the same time and become information for paintings.
Kathy, can I say something about coming to the cabin?
I can bring them back. So I would commute to teach, and I never knew when I came home what I would be seeing. And he loved doing this, and it's still pretty much the way he works. Changing, 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 changing. And he also works in multiples. So if there's 3 frogs, there were probably 12, and the others are gone. And you're lucky if you sometimes get one, because this body of work you're looking at here, in the way that he works, he climbs around on the walls and on the floor, and he continually changes things, and he will change things within hours. You walk out and you walk in, and he's painted sections out or sections in to the whole group at the same time. The whole room will change, and a day later, he'll paint it all out. It will be gone. So this is Michael about 6 years ago, and he's now dealing with rheumatoid arthritis, and all that he does is paint. He doesn't do anything but paint. And these 2 paintings I threw in here to comment on the fact that these are the earliest rabbits that I still have. And they're really indicative of the way he is interested in combining in all his work drawing with the painting. There's a negotiation that goes back and forth about laying in the paint, drawing on the paint. One of the reasons he loves hardware paint is it dries in a couple hours, and he can change a painting 3 times in the same day. So this is early work done like in the 70s, but this is work done this year. And most of these are gone. One of them's in the show. And this is him, and he's 80 years old now. And the trumpet frogs that are on the show were the last thing, were done just the week before they came to pick up the work for the show. So, And this is Michael last week, just starting a new layering in of stuff. So the paintings have changed about 8-10 times. He's cut them up and reconfigured them and laid it. They're completely different at this point. One last thing I'll say about Michael's earlier times. When Michael came to Detroit, he had left the University of Michigan because they'd put him on probation for being a moody guy and only painting in black and white. And they put him on probation, and he was doing images, which he's been interested in the same images for 50 years, but he was drawing things like bird ladies running upstairs with 6 pair of tits. And they thought he was a disturbed guy. And they said, you can stay here, but you're going on probation. And he said, the heck I am. And he took out a long scroll of paper and a can of blue paint, and he painted all his iconography that he was interested in, rabbits and frogs and cups and snakes, with one brush, one can of blue paint. And he took it to Robert Wilbert at Wayne State, and Robert said, come on in, and gave him a room. And he was always grateful to Robert Wilbert for seeing something in him that changed his future. He spent the next decade or so here. And that's how we know him. Yeah. So I think that's all I'll say. I've been just watching him do this work forever. And we'll go on to Bob, who has known him forever too.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out today. I have a lot of history with everybody here, and I know a lot of you all know about Michael, but some of you don't. So first, I can't remember the first time I met Michael. I mean, we were in Convention Hall sharing studios, and Convention Hall had offices on the second floor off of Cass Avenue at Prentice, and people rented spaces they were offices, and there was a toilet down the hall and a mop sink that we all used, because you have to have some water for your paint and whatever you're doing. And so the first time I moved in was in 1967 when the riots occurred. And I knew somebody down the hall that I used to get marijuana from. So I've been in the building before, and there was John Egner, he had a studio down the hall, and Bob Hanamura, who was an architect, he was in the building. And so I talked to my friend Gordon Newton, and I said, look, we're gonna get a studio in this building, and he said, okay, and we rented this space that John Haggerty and Bradley Jones had moved out of. And it was roughly, maybe 40 feet by 10, 12 feet wide. And there were 2 of those spaces with a connecting door. So Gordy had one side and I had the other side. And across the hall there was another office space that was a little bit bigger, and that's where I met Mike and Kathy. I think it was after 1967. And I had just been thrown out of Cranbrook Academy of Art, and I was looking to get back in the building to get a studio. And I was talking with Mike, and Mike said, well, come on, here, you can work over here on this wall. And Gordy had been in a little off a room off of Mike's studio that was maybe 12 by 12, and it was a separate space. So here we're all like in this space, and Mike was painting a painting on the ceiling. He was actually throwing the paint up on the ceiling. Well, it didn't stick so well. A lot of the paint ended up on the floor. And Katheryn said he was using a fork to throw the paint up on the ceiling. And I just thought, this is so unconventional. This is really, you know, it kind of, I couldn't understand it. You know, his thinking about his work was so unconventional, you know, and it really impressed me that how somebody could have this much freedom with their thinking. And so, you know, I had just kind of left the craft world. I was in the ceramics department for 4 years. That was my major. But I had done some welding in the sculpture department, and not a lot of painting. I did some printmaking and stuff like that at school. But so I began a whole new career of, you know, going into the fine arts, and I was, you know, really interested in what Michael was doing with his work and Gordy was doing with his work. But I had to like earn my way into this club because it was, you know, it was art, it wasn't crafts. And crafts seemed to be separated. Every year at the DIA, it was the craft show one year and the fine arts show the next year, the Michigan Fine Arts. So I think it was 1971, and there was the 12 Statement show at the DIA, and Mike was in the 12 Statements show. This was after the Willis Gallery had opened, and he had the first show in the gallery, I think with somebody else, right? It was Stan, or it wasn't Stan DeLega, was it? I don't remember. But anyway, Mike, the people that started the gallery, the board, decided Mike was the best choice to open the gallery because he was the strongest visual artist making work at the time. And that's just, you know, he was well deserved in having that honor to open the Willis Gallery. But the piece that he did at the 12 Statement show at the DIA, I think Suzanne Hilberry was an assistant curator at the time, and so she was interacting with the artist. And Mike had laid out this paper on the floor, and it was quite large, maybe like 25 feet by 25 feet. And he kept dividing the paper up and marking it with shapes of triangular shapes using butter and graphite as his medium. And it was really an interesting piece. He called it the Rolling Diamond. And when I heard that title and saw the work, it just, there again, it was like throwing paint on the ceiling again. He had this terrific sense of his ability to improvise on what he was creating. So as time went on, he had moved over to 4th Street in Holden. They had a house over there, and Mike was building a wall sculpture for Jim Duffy for the warehouse. And this was an abstraction panel that was maybe 4 feet by 12 feet or something like that. it was on plywood, and he had fastened bolts to it, and he put sections of cut-off pipe from the Duffy company, and he had gotten wire from the streets, in the alley. He found telephone wire and different types of wire that he kind of drew with and painted. He painted and he burnt stuff into this mixture on the surface, and it was really a sculptural anomaly that it was so organic looking. And at the time, Gordy Newton was working with a body grinder and grinding plywood and breaking stuff as well. And here I'm watching these guys and I'm thinking, what am I missing? I'm like, I'm not doing something like this. I'm doing some paintings, and and they're going wild with, creating assemblages. And later on, I picked up and I made some stuff but it wasn't in the forefront like Mike and Gordon were having these epiphanies with their work and just really creating things that had never been done in the history of Detroit. So I think it's nice to see that groundbreaking work, and I think that piece went up to the Duffy warehouse and was hanging on the wall. I worked for Jim Duffy for years in the warehouse, helping install work, and that was another experience, but I don't have time to talk about it. But I want to talk again about Mike had moved to Northville with Katheryn, and after Katheryn's father died, the house that they lived in, Mike and Kathy took it over, and they had their studios there. And then they moved up to Lewiston. And I would follow Mike, up and just try and be supportive of what he was doing, and Katheryn, and it really made, it gave me a lot of inspiration in seeing his work, and it affected my work. And, I wasn't trying to copy what he was doing, but the input in any kind of a movement, people cross over, their ideas cross over. So I tried to work along those lines. But the work that Mike had done in the cabin and in the new studio that Katheryn had built, and Mike was working on these paintings that were heads of birds. And I looked at it and I couldn't tell what it was. I had no idea that it was a head of a bird. It looked like an abstract sculpture that he had done previously. But the bird head, when I think Katheryn told me those are bird heads. And, again, I was so surprised and awestruck that I couldn't see that until I knew what the title was. And so when you look at Michael's work, it's always, there's more to it than the first glance. It has a lot of depth and meaning to it beyond what it says visually. I think I've got my 10 minutes in, but the other piece was the roll-up scroll pieces that were shown at the Willis Gallery in the 70s. And it was a solo show, and Mike created the work in the convention hall. And these were pieces of aluminum siding turned backwards, so the insulation was part of the piece. And he put these scrolls, rolled up paper that were like scrolls, into the panel, and he used some gutter downspouts that he flattened and bolts. And then he took it over to the common ground, and he used George Edel's Bridgeport to drill these holes into it. And I just thought, it's not a drill press, it's not for drilling holes, but Mike, you know, that's what he did. And he was so obsessive about putting these holes into this piece. I don't know if that was the first time that I saw him do that, but he certainly has put a lot of holes in a lot of art. So, thanks. Nancy.
Oh, here we go. You know, all of a sudden you got this memory of Michael wandering around the cast corridor with a shotgun. And that's right around the time I was thinking maybe I should leave town. Maybe it was 1973 or something. I think he used to shoot holes too, not just use presses. Anyway, I'm glad this is working out. Yesterday was a little wild when we tried to practice. I moved to the Jeffries housing. Does this microphone does this have too much bass and is fuzzy? No? All right. I had a little kid. I left this crazy communist family that had a commune. That's how I met John Sinclair. People were talking about building bombs in the basement. At a certain point, my husband wanted us to move to a boat in the Clinton River without a head or not a kitchen, you say, a galley. And I just said, I want to go to college. But I had never finished high school. So I managed somehow to make a few meetings, and they let me move into the married student housing at the Jeffries Housing Project, and I had to wait till I was 21 to attend Wayne State. I took a test, everything was fine. So my neighbor was Michael Luchs and Yvonne Callender and Marky, and then Sarah. They lived kitty corner, and nobody ever speaks of Yvonne Callender, but she was a nurse, she was tall, she was elegant, she was a Brit. And another amazing fact I think about Michael is that he worked in the Secret Service. Michael was in the Army. There's all kinds of stories about Michael. And when he married Yvonne, who everybody calls Cal, they kicked him out because he married a foreigner. And I think that's when he went to you. I can't quite know all the stories. I just remember him telling me that she'd come home from being a nurse for 12 hours and have a cup of Campbell's soup. And 30 years later, I'm having Campbell's soup in my studio in California, and all of a sudden I think, well, this isn't cool, but it really is. So I was waiting to go to school, and I was modeling and playing in a band, a polka band, not a nice band. And someone invited me to take a drawing class. And I audited this class at what we called arts and crafts. And these drawings sucked. They were horrible. I had this idea that, when I went to museums, I knew about art a little bit, but not really. And these drawings just were all over the page. They were too big. I couldn't get anything in. They were just dreadful. And Yvonne actually said, these are terrific. And I said, you are truly nuts. She said, my husband should see these. And I said, please, don't. Please, this is embarrassing. So Michael comes over and says, holy shit, you're not a draftsman. I said, right. He said, no, you're a painter. These are the drawings of a painter. And I really thought this scruffy guy was just absolutely out of his mind. He said, no, I said, I'm gonna learn to draw. It's gonna take 10 years and then I'll learn to paint. He said, learn to draw while you're learning to paint. And I didn't get it. So, so I knew Michael, this was in 64, 65, this was like the end of 1966. And he had just gotten to Wayne State, and I didn't understand anything about these strange drawings that he was making, electrifying frogs, Indian heads. But he brought me some paint and canvases, And I started to paint. I'm still painting. Thank you, Michael. But something that I think is very odd is I'm aware, and I've thought of this for decades. Michael, I think, really is a kind of genius, and he affected every artist who ever met him in Detroit. Sestok is one of the few honest enough to talk about how he was influenced. I don't think Gordy Newton would ever mention it, but I remember figure things absolutely changing. Michael and Kathy came to visit me where I live on Sobieski Street after the opening, the next day after the opening, and Michael walks into my kitchen and looks at this little Ellen Phelan that I have that's a figure that looks like a skinny woman, but it's the interior of a butterfly, and the butterfly's wings are really guys' profiles. It's very sexy. You know, the lips are sort of in the sexy place. And he just walked into the kitchen and said, "Hey, that's my image. I did that image." And I remembered those images. Ellen just ripped them off. It happened all the time. People just took everything from Michael. And Michael, I really finally figured out something I could say about his work, which I'll sort of finish with. But, you know, he didn't care. Only I never figured out to do what he was doing or to learn the crazy matrix that he was so invested in. I stayed a kind of hardcore, slightly aggressive image maker, and everybody else got hip right out of Luchs' studio. I mean, it's really, really true. He was powerful. And Kathy's right. You have to hand it to Bob Wilbert. He looked like a fuddy-duddy, but he took in all kinds of people and was interested in various strong, interesting art that was real art. And when Michael just, I don't know how to describe it. The work was intimate, it was fractured, it was deeply personal. At the same time, he really was a bad boy, Michael Luchs. He was a naughty, naughty man. There's no doubt about it. So, you know, and I mind actually. We've been friends the whole time, except when I got furious. And I just don't know of anybody but Bob who's given him credit. And his stuff is just everywhere. And I think often there's somebody with the real ideas and then somebody else who profits by them. This often happens. I think this happened a lot. Anyway, I've been thinking about, Cal left him. She left him. And he kept coming over to my house. And I was lonely. And eventually we got together, and it was an amazingly intense, beautiful, wild love affair. And when he had a lot of love affairs, Michael did. And Kathy and I have been friends forever, but I remember hating her with a passion. I just couldn't get over this young babe. And Cal would come back from England, and then she'd go away again. It was just a nightmare. And in trying to think about something beyond my personal gratitude and deep affection for this very crazy guy, I just tried to stay calm today. And I finally wrote something out on my computer, and of course then my computer crashed, so I had to copy it by hand. And when you think of him, like, I remember the struggles that he had with himself, moral struggles, and I really think of Michael Luchs as a very moral, upstanding, conflicted guy. He was raised by this minister who took him rabbit hunting, by the way. And I think with his intense desire to kind of be upstanding, he really, the truth is the demons and the nightmares, he had an ungodly amount of guilt, and he really drank. He drank, he did all kinds of things. He was just a real mess for a lot of years, as well as a beautiful kind of angel. And I began to think about him in a way that actually doesn't include words, and this is what I wrote finally when I could write something. I think he has an uncanny twist of perception. He talked once to me about a matrix that he twisted around, and I can't remember verbatim what he said, but I knew that what he was saying was true, was almost indecipherable. And as I tried to think about it, it's not just that he twisted ordinary perceptions, and it wasn't just that he was making something accessible that can't be seen or known, really. And he wasn't showing, I don't think he shows something when he was starting out, you know, these odd frogs. He lost his work. He always left. He didn't care. I don't think it was showing something behind the objects he could see and the objects of his desire. I don't think it was a reconstruction of a cubist vantage point and then convoluting it kind of away from cubism, although sometimes you might have thought that, but it never stayed cubistic. It always turned into something softer with a crazy edge, and then he electrified everything. He drew and said it was a wire, not a line, and he drew a plug attached to the wire, and then he drew in an outlet. And I must have had 50 of these drawings that got stolen out of my first studio in New York City by a crazed lunatic, and I tell you, I still miss having those drawings. I think his nervous system is and was so tattered and frayed and fractured, and that he was a guy who loved what he loved so deeply and truly, but Kathy can testify, he could rarely express emotion. He's not a direct person. He expresses it in odd ways. I think it all came out in the painting, and the act of painting, and the wild desire to communicate something, and getting rid of sacred fears and knowing deep, deep down that he was twisted up and floating and yet solid ground, somehow really on some amazing piece of solid ground, but maybe it was in another dimension. I think Michael paints to exist. When Kathy talks about he just paints and he paints over and he paints over, I don't think it's as nutty as it was 30 years ago, and I think he's calmed down maybe in the last 10. But could we look at the cabin again a little bit? Oh, great. I just think one of the reasons that we're all so moved by it is that his need to paint is something so complex and so deep and so powerful and something so not intellectual, but grounded in his incredible intelligence, that he's like the Pied Piper, it's mesmerizing. So I came and visited, I had this teaching gig on the East Coast, and I came and visited one summer. I think Michael said, well, we're out of coffee. I think we're out of tea. I think we have oatmeal. Do you like oatmeal, Nance? I said, yeah, I like oatmeal, but what about chicken? Oh, we don't eat meat much. And I figured, shit, I better buy some food. I went to Trader Joe's. So I bring all this food. I mean, Kathy's working away. Michael has a little pension from the Army. He said, this is too much. I don't know what to do with all this food. It made him very anxious. I mean, he's changed. He's very happy to have a lot of food these days. But I just remember this. He was painting on the walls in the cabin, as Kathy saw a million times, and it was an underwater scene with fishes. And he'd just gotten his check. He said, I'm gonna go to the hardware store and buy a can of red, I think. And then he said, do you think you guys wanna go to lunch? And he gave me this look. I said, oh yeah, we're going to lunch. And Kathy and I had this great afternoon. It was at a hotel. It was a fancy hotel on the lake. We were just hanging out for hours. So we get back to the house. He'd seen something about, the Iraq War? Which war? I have some pictures of this somewhere. All of a sudden, these fish had swords going through them, machine guns going through them, blood dripping out of their eyes and nose, and it was just an absolute other world. I think in this idea that his existence is experienced through painting, that for a very long time, the idea of profiting by this action offended him deeply. And, he lost his work, he didn't take good care of it. One of the most horrible things Greggy Murphy ever did was take hundreds of his drawings and try to sell them to Marie Dennison. And who knows where they are now. Michael was mad, I was horrified. But I think I also know that he knows that it's important to be acknowledged, but I have this great memory of you guys coming to New York. Michael was somebody, I don't know how it happened, maybe through Sam Wagstaff. He was in a show at the Willard Gallery, which at Uptown, and at that time, it was a very, very important gallery that serious intellectual artists showed at and was reviewed consistently by great minds writing for the Times and Art in America, not American art. And he wouldn't go in. He just wouldn't go in. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. This guy isn't a hustler. I mean, he wasn't going to. He was so beautiful. Just his presence. I mean, this is him, we're seeing him at 80 years old. When he was 35 years old, it was another story. He just wouldn't go into the gallery, and even I knew he should go in. I drove him up there, and we sat around. I went in, I came out, and I described the show to him. He just didn't want to deal with the business end. And I think more than anything, he believed in magic. Maybe I'll end it there. Thanks.
All right. Dinner is ready.
Well, aren't there questions from the gang?
Oh, yeah, it probably is.
He painted over, constantly painted. He does to this day. He'll change the room of paintings every day, several times a day. And with his early paintings, when we divorced, he gave me all his rabbits to keep for him. And he left them in Ann Arbor, or I was going to grad school. And years later, he came back. And what happened in the years after that, if the work was really good, like the two little early rabbits I have a whole folio of those. I hid them when he made them. And so they still exist. And I would stack works on top of works so it'd be too much trouble to get to them. I did that for years. But there were many times where I would go I'd leave for 4 days to go teach and come back. And he had decided that his body of work was very good, and I spent I have one little weekend, and I'm documenting, because I've been documenting everything, and I put it up, I photographed, and we put it away, and then he got it back out and painted it all out, and this happened so many times that I would get quite upset. But in the last 5 years, I would say, since he's gotten older, we talk about it, and he'll say, take what you want. So if I'm not sure, I'll roll up a frog, or I'll take a rabbit and I'll put it away. And after a couple of months, we'll get them back out and look at them again. And then, or he'll say, I'll trade you. If you give me that back, you can have this one, because I can fix that one. One of the things that Nancy ended with, probably the reason why he wouldn't go into the Willard is he thinks it's all not very good. And he's always trying to make it better. And the night before they came to pick up this show, I was in tears because he started to paint on some of the paintings. And I started screaming, and he started to wipe the paint away. And he was going to get the piece that you picked out, Tim, he was going to do something to that one. And I was saying, no, they're coming tomorrow. They have slides. They've made their decisions. But he always thinks that the work isn't enough. You know, so part of that process of continuing constantly is he's always looking for what he can find out that would be better and how he can make something better. But I have more images of work that don't exist than do, you know. So.
I have a microphone if anybody has any other questions. Yeah?
I think that proves my theory.
I was wondering if there was some relationship with music and what he thought about Detroit, the city itself.
What is that?
What is his relationship with music and also the city, Detroit?
Music?
Music and also the city. If there is like
Did you mean about the John Sinclair kicking up the jams? You saw the catalog.
yeah, John Sinclair, yeah.
Can I answer that one? I've answered this one before. The person who wrote that catalog, she gave the Cats Corridor a fabulous show, but she made a lot of things up. She inferred that because John Sinclair did kick out the jams, we were also inspired by his music that we started to paint. That wasn't it. Nobody cared much about John Sinclair. We listened to the Shadow Facts. I mean, that's the band that we always went to. People listened to rock and roll. These guys were painting. They were just painting because they're artists, you know. And I've even had people call me when people want to do, every now and then someone wants to do a graduate school thesis in art history about the Cats Corridor. And years ago, a lovely young woman called me and said, well, I really know so much. I'm very interested in the relationship to the music. I said there was no relationship to the music. You know, she just put that in. It's a nice idea, but I was there. We were not, this art came from us. It didn't come from listening to Kick Out the Jams, I'm sorry to say. And this kid said, you have to be wrong. You're wrecking my thesis. And she just wrote it anyway. And is this about the scholarship at U of M? I don't know.
If you could hear the background to these videos, Michael always has music on, but it's just for the energy. It's just for the ambiance. So he's not making any. He's not paying attention. He just puts we got an old radio. He turns it on and works. So.
Well, a lot of artists do. You know, sometimes I listen to Aretha. When I get to Janis Joplin, I know I'm really old. But every now and then, nothing will do. I think lots of us in our studio practice listen to certain things, don't you? You know, and when you're listening to Bach, you know you're really getting near the end of something. What do you listen to? Kick out the jams, I'm gonna kill myself.
I listen to a variety of music. But, you know, when you're working, you don't pay attention to it.
Right. Fades out.
It's just noise, white noise.
Sorry. Oh, at the American Academy of Arts and Letters?
They didn't survive. He took a lot of flack for making work that was unsustainable. And that's often part of his fear, that, you know, things aren't going to work out very well with, and he's much more comfortable just to work and not worry about it leaving the studio and what will happen, you know. The ones that were made out of plaster, and some of them were chicken wire with bird feathers and stuff. I think he just repainted one a couple years ago. Yeah.
What were Michael's early inspirations and what inspires him now, like today, in his 80s, and still painting these beautiful objects?
Well, you know, he likes some of the philosophers, and so, you know, he's got drawings that are pretty funny. He'll say there'll be images that will say "sleep of reason, my ass," you know, and and he writes things all over things, you know. So I always thought from being around him that he channeled his experiences in a subconscious way. So, you know, once Nancy and Peter Williams and Michael were at a dinner together at Sandra Shimsky's, and Nancy and Peter argued the whole evening while Michael listened. And the next morning, he went into the studio and painted 3 bears holding painting palettes up like they were shields. And I said, you know, I always would tell him every time this happened, he did it. His friend took him to see The Matrix, and he did a beautiful print of a head floating on an anvil, you know. And I said, that's the movie last night, or that's the argument that you were listening to with Nancy and Peter Williams, you know. And so a lot of the imagery would just kind of come out of him through things that he was experiencing. I can say he does not like to go to museums or galleries because he's always had a fear he'd be influenced.
Oh, dear.
I go alone. I mean, to get him to go to even his own show, he's always said exhibitions are like funerals, you know? So he doesn't like to look at other people's work. But he does. He likes to peek. I'll show him stuff on the computer and books, your book, and Bob brings him books. Yeah.
He likes poems, too. You know, I want to rephrase something. I guess there's that song, Starry, Starry Night. But, you know, most songwriters don't look at paintings while they're writing songs. You know, sometimes somebody will write something in particular about a painting. But, you know, it's such a good idea, but we mostly don't. They don't do it, really. I've known some writers. Just, we would like the world to be more synergistic, but, you know, things get separated.
I have a question. Yeah, I would like to know more about the film that you produced, about the Cat's Corridor artist, and if there's any influence, like the collaboration.
Because we're going to eat, I'll briefly tell you that on July 12th, I'm coming back to talk about that film and to show that film more formally to if you're around. But primarily that film has 2 aspects that were goals of mine. One was to bring everybody into the same room that was in the same room at the time, everybody that I thought was communicating with each other on a more substantial, more relevant way, like, you know, Nancy, Bob, Michael.
Ellen and I came in very late.
They came in late because I was going
We were
around
old
with a
when
silent Super 8 camera. Well, what happened was Suzanne Hilberry and Marcia Miro wanted me to show those films to the public, but they were silent. And there were about 20 hours of silent films that were unedited. So they gave me a small amount of money, and I wrote a grant to actually edit them and make a piece that could be comprehended as as a film, Michael was very upset that I would. In his mind, he's very, very literal. He thinks I'm cutting up that film forever, and I digitized it, and it was made on a computer after it was digitized, and new information was brought in, and all the voices. I went out and I looked. I met all the artists who were still living and had them speak, so I got hours and hours of Nancy and Michael and Ellen Phelan talking, and Bob, and that was all edited, but Michael didn't want me to do that. But I was concerned, I will say this one last thing, I was concerned that the community at large that were like collectors and museum people and gallery people, they were sort of romantically in love with the silent past. And I was frustrated and a little angry that many of us were being ignored as if we were dead. They just wanted to look at the past.
And the guys were so cute.
That film is a statement about all the energy of being an artist, and that it's a lifetime commitment, even if you're not being recognized or not getting support, that we still do it. And so it was looking at the younger selves, and then the sustained commitment over time by the artists, So, but Paul Schwartz had died. Ann Michalowski we lost. She's not in the film, but I dedicated it to her. I hope that answers some of your questions. So I went out with a video camera for a couple years and got the audio and Nancy and Ellen Phelan, because definitely they were there and they needed to be in the film. Yeah.
And Ellen was smart enough to put really cute pictures, beautiful pictures of herself when she was 20, and it never occurred to me to do that, and which made me sad later. But if you've seen the film, don't you think it's weird that there's a marsh and all of a sudden there's New England and we're in Ipswich on the water? I mean, Kathy came out. I was living in a house on stilts in Ipswich, and I just thought it's so not Detroit. Works,
but your paintings are in the film.
Oh. Right, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so thank you so much.
Thank you.